Pull up a chair. The sun's bleeding out. And that's when the ghosts like to walk. Out here in the West, we like to think a man's character is as plain as the brand on his cattle. But the truth is a lot murkier than that. It gets hidden in the dust, buried under lies, and sometimes the blackest heart beats in the chest of the man you trust with your life. This is a story like that. A story about a man who rode into town looking for a monster, and the terrible discovery that he'd been calling that monster friend his whole life. The man who rode into Dusty Creek was a stranger to the town, but an old acquaintance of the ghosts that haunted it. His name was John, and for the last 5 years, he had been a man running from his own name, from the reputation that clung to it like a shroud. He rode with the weary posture of a man who has traveled too far and seen too much, his shoulders slumped, his gaze fixed on the hazy, heat-shimmered horizon. The dust of 1,000 lonely miles was caked on his duster and the brim of his hat, a second skin of anonymity. He had come to Dusty Creek not for sanctuary, but for a reckoning. Tucked in the inner pocket of his coat was a worn, tear-stained letter from his younger brother, Caleb. It was the last letter he had ever sent, full of hopeful, naive talk about a gold strike, a new future, and the steadfast friendship of their childhood companion, Elias Thorne. 3 months after that letter was sent, a terse telegram had found John in a Wyoming cattle camp. Caleb was dead. Killed by claim jumpers, the official report had said. Robbed and shot in a remote canyon. Case cold. John, a man who had made his living reading the subtle lies in a poker player's eyes, had never believed it. Caleb was a good kid, but he was no gunfighter. Claim jumpers were usually brutal and efficient, but the story felt too neat, too clean. He had spent the last 6 months working his way south, a cold, hard knot of purpose tightening in his gut. He had come to Dusty Creek to look into the eyes of the men who had last seen his brother alive. He had come to find the truth. And if that truth had a face, he had come to kill it. The town that greeted him was a disappointment. It was a single, dusty street, a collection of tired, sun-bleached buildings leaning against each other for support, all of it baking under the oppressive glare of the Arizona sun. But there was a newness to it as well, a prosperity that felt out of place. The saloon was a large, 2-story affair with fresh paint. The sheriff's office was a solid new brick building, a symbol of unshakable authority. A bank stood where there had once been a vacant lot. Someone had been pouring money into this place. He stabled his horse, the liveryman's eyes darting away from his, a common reaction in a town with a guilty conscience. As he walked down the main street, he felt the weight of 100 unseen eyes. The people of Dusty Creek moved with a quiet, hurried desperation, their shoulders hunched, as if they were all afraid of being noticed. A deep, unspoken fear hung in the air, as thick and choking as the dust itself. This was not a town enjoying its prosperity. It was a town enduring it. He pushed through the batwing doors of the saloon. The air was cool and dark and smelled of stale beer and quiet desperation. He took a spot at the end of the bar, a position that gave him a clear view of the entire room. He ordered a whiskey and let his eyes adjust. He saw them immediately with new law. They were not the usual kind of small-town deputies. They were hard-faced men, wearing new, matching gun belts, their hands resting a little too close to their pistols. They were not peacekeepers, they were guards. A voice, warm and familiar, cut through the silence. John, is that really you?" John turned. Standing in the doorway, silhouetted against the bright, cruel glare of the street, was a man he would have known anywhere. He was taller now, broader in the shoulders, and he wore a gleaming silver star on his vest, but his eyes held the same friendly, intelligent light. It was Elias Thorne. A wave of genuine, unadulterated relief washed over John, the first clean emotion he had felt in months. "Elias," he said, a slow, real smile breaking through the dusty mask of his face. "You son of a gun." They met in the middle of the room, clasping hands, then pulling each other into a rough, heartfelt embrace. It was a reunion of brothers, of the last 2 remaining members of a childhood pact. They had grown up together, run wild in these hills together. John, the quiet, watchful one, Caleb, the laughing, optimistic one, and Elias, the smart, ambitious one. "What in God's name are you doing here?" Elias asked, pulling back, his face a mixture of shock and genuine pleasure. "And wearing a star, no less. When did this happen?" "It's a long story," Elias said, his smile turning sad. He looked down for a moment. I'm so sorry, John. About Caleb. I can't tell you how sorry I am. He was like a brother to me, too. The sincerity in Elias's voice was a balm to John's raw soul. I know, John said, his own voice thick. That's why I'm here, Eli. The official story. It doesn't sit right with me. I had to come. I had to see for myself. Of course you did, Elias said, his expression turning to one of grim, professional duty. He clapped John on the shoulder. And I'm glad you're here. I've been running into stone walls on this case for months. These claim jumpers, they're ghosts. They hit and they vanish. But now there are two of us. We'll find them, John. I swear on my star, and I swear on Caleb's memory. We will find the men who did this, and we will see them hang. As Elias spoke, the hard-faced deputies in the corner straightened up, their expressions turning from lazy arrogance to watchful respect. The entire saloon seemed to exhale, the tension that had filled the room since John's arrival dissolving in the presence of the powerful, confident sheriff. That evening, Elias insisted John take a room at the hotel, at his expense. They shared a bottle of whiskey in the sheriff's office, talking late into the night. Elias told him the story of Dusty Creek's transformation. After a series of devastating bandit raids 5 years ago, the old sheriff had been killed, and the town was on the verge of becoming a ghost town. Elias, who had been working as a bookkeeper, had stepped up. He had organized a militia, driven the bandits out, and had been elected sheriff by a grateful populace. He had used his business acumen to attract investors, to secure the new silver strike in the hills, and had single-handedly dragged the town into a new era of prosperity and order. It was a story of heroism and civic duty. Elias laid out the details of Caleb's murder. He had been working a new claim, deep in Miller's Canyon. He had been found by a passing prospector, shot twice in the back. His small pouch of gold dust was gone. The tracks of 2 horses were found, but they vanished in the rocky terrain. There were no witnesses. It was a cold, brutal, and tragically common frontier story. John listened, the cold knot in his gut slowly beginning to loosen. He had come here expecting to fight a lonely war, to face a town of strangers. Instead, he had found his oldest and closest friend, a man who was now the most powerful symbol of the law in the valley. His quest for justice was no longer a solo endeavor. He had an ally, a brother. As he went to his hotel room that night, for the first time in a long time, John allowed himself to feel a flicker of hope. He and Elias, together again. They would find the truth, and they would make the guilty pay. He did not realize, as he drifted into an exhausted sleep, that the man he was hunting was sleeping just a few doors down the hall. The next few days were a strange and disorienting experience for John. He was a man accustomed to the fringes, to the solitude of the trail, and the anonymity of the drifter's life. Now, he found himself at the center of the town's attention, the honored guest and partner of the powerful sheriff Elias Thorne. Elias was a masterful host and a brilliant politician. He introduced John to the town's small circle of influential citizens, banker, the mine supervisor, the saloon owner, all of whom were men who owed their prosperity and their loyalty to Elias. John here is a legend in his own right, Elias would say, clapping John on the back. And he's going to be helping me bring his brother's killers to justice. With his skills and my authority, there's nowhere these men can hide. John was uncomfortable with the praise and the public attention, but he went along with it. He saw the way the townspeople looked at Elias with a mixture of awe and a deep, ingrained fear that they tried to disguise as respect. Elias was the sun, and the entire town were planets, held in his orbit by an invisible, powerful gravity. He had indeed brought order to Dusty Creek. The streets were clean, the saloon was mostly quiet, and his deputies, while hard-faced, were brutally efficient at quelling any sign of trouble. But the order felt sterile, brittle. It was the order of a prison yard, not a thriving community. The town was prosperous, but it had no joy. The investigation began in earnest. Elias opened his files to John, showing him the meager evidence, a map of the canyon where Caleb's body was found, the deputy's report, and a list of known outlaws who had been operating in the territory at the time. It all seemed professional, thorough, and utterly useless. I've hit a wall at every turn, Elias said, his face a mask of frustration. The trail is as cold as a winter grave. But maybe you'll see something I missed. A fresh pair of eyes. They rode out together to Miller's Canyon, the place where Caleb had died. It was a remote, desolate place, a scar of jagged rock and stunted juniper trees. The air was still and heavy with a sense of loss. John dismounted, his heart a cold, heavy stone in his chest. This was where his brother, his laughing, hopeful brother, had breathed his last. He walked the ground, his hunter's eyes scanning every detail, trying to read the story that the land had to tell. He found the spot where the body had been discovered, marked by a simple wooden cross Elias had placed there. He saw the scuff marks in the dirt, the faint, faded tracks. He was a master tracker, and what he saw troubled him. The report said there were 2 sets of tracks, 2 horses. But the sign here was confused, muddled. It looked like more than 2 horses had been here, their tracks overlapping, deliberately obscured. "It's been months," Elias said, coming to stand beside him. "The wind, the rain, it's wiped the slate clean." John didn't reply. He continued to circle the area, his unease growing. He found a single, spent cartridge casing half buried in the dust, missed by the initial investigation. He picked it up. It was a .44-40 Winchester, a common enough round. But there was something odd about it. There was a small, distinctive scratch near the primer, the kind made by a faulty firing pin. "Find something?" Elias asked, his voice sharp. "Just an old shell," John said, slipping it into his pocket without showing it to his friend. He didn't know why. It was an instinct, a flicker of the old caution that had kept him alive for so long. They spent the day investigating, riding the trails, talking to a few grizzled prospectors who lived in the hills. The prospectors were wary, their answers to John's questions evasive. But when Elias fixed them with his steady, authoritative gaze, they would reluctantly confirm the official story. A pair of rough-looking strangers had been seen in the area around the time of the murder. No, they didn't get a good look at them. Yes, they were probably the ones. It was all too neat, too clean. Every lead was a dead end. Every witness told the same vague and helpful story. John felt like he was walking through a landscape that had been carefully stage-managed. He was not uncovering a trail, he was being led down one. That evening, back in town, the first real crack in the mirror appeared. John was in the saloon, nursing a whiskey, his mind churning over the inconsistencies of the day, when a young saloon girl, a newcomer named Maria, nervously approached him. You're Caleb's brother, aren't you?" she whispered, her eyes darting toward the sheriff's deputies at the far end of the room. John nodded, his gaze sharpening. "Caleb, he was a nice boy," she said, her hands twisting in her apron. "He was always so happy. He was in here, the night before he was celebrating. He was with the sheriff. They were laughing, drinking toasts to their new partnership, they said." She didn't say anything more. She saw one of the deputies looking at her, and with a small gasp of fear, she turned and scurried away. Her words hit John with the force of a physical blow. A partnership. The letter Caleb had sent had mentioned a gold strike, a new future, but he had never mentioned a partner. Why had Elias, his oldest friend, his brother in all but blood, neglected to mention that he and Caleb were official partners in the very claim that had supposedly gotten him killed? It was a small omission. It could have been an oversight, something lost in the grief of the moment. But coupled with the strange tracks in the canyon, the unique shell casing in his pocket, and the palpable fear that gripped the entire town, it felt like something more. It felt like the corner of a beautiful, elaborate lie that was just beginning to unravel. John sat in the saloon, the whiskey turning to ash in his mouth. He looked across the street at the brick sheriff's office, at the light burning in the window where his friend, his ally, was working to find his brother's killers. And for the first time, a cold, terrible suspicion began to take root in his soul. He had ridden into Dusty Creek to find an enemy. What if he had been shaking that enemy's hand all along? The seed of doubt, once planted, grew with a chilling speed in the fertile ground of John's mind. Elias's omission of his partnership with Caleb was a discordant note in the symphony of their renewed friendship, a note that John could not ignore. He began to move with a new purpose, his investigation taking on a dual nature. In the daylight, he was the grieving brother, the loyal partner to the sheriff, riding the trails and asking the questions that Elias wanted him to ask. But at night, he became the man he used to be, a ghost, a silent seeker of hidden truths. His focus became the single piece of physical evidence he possessed, the scratched .44 Winchester casing. It was a tiny, insignificant object, but it was real. It was not a story, not a memory, but a tangible piece of the puzzle. He knew that a rifle, like a man, had a unique signature. A faulty firing pin that left a specific mark was as good as a fingerprint. If he could find the rifle that had fired that shell, he would find his brother's killer. He began his search in the most logical place, the town's gunsmith. The gunsmith was an old, roomy-eyed man named Peterson, a craftsman who had been in Dusty Creek for 40 years and knew every firearm in the valley. John approached him not as an investigator, but as a customer. "I'm looking to buy a new rifle," John said, leaning on the counter of the cluttered, oil-scented shop. "A Winchester 73, but I'm particular. I'm looking for one with a smooth action." As Peterson began pulling rifles from the rack, John subtly guided the conversation. He talked about firearms, about their quirks, their personalities. "It's funny," John mused, "how a gun can have a flaw that makes it unique. I once saw a Colt that always shaved a little lead, and a rifle with a firing pin that left a scratch on the primer, just like a signature." He watched the old gunsmith's face carefully. A flicker of recognition, quickly suppressed, crossed Peterson's features. "Can't say I've seen anything like that recently," the old man mumbled, turning away to busy himself with a rifle on his workbench. His hands, usually so steady, had a slight tremor. The old man was lying. John knew it. He had seen something. He pressed, gently. "A scratch, right here," he said, pulling out the casing from his pocket and placing it on the counter, next to a small pile of spent primers. "Just like this one." Peterson stared at the casing, his face going pale. He looked up at John, his eyes wide with a fear that was all too familiar in this town. I don't know nothing about that," he stammered, pushing the casing back toward John as if it were a venomous snake. "You should go. The sheriff. He don't like people asking too many questions." John left the shop, the old man's fear confirmation. Peterson knew the rifle, but he was too terrified of the sheriff to speak. The walls of Elias's authority were even thicker than he had imagined. John knew he had to force the issue. That night, he broke into the gunsmith's shop. He moved with a practiced, silent efficiency, a phantom in the darkness. He did not ransack the place. He was looking for one thing, the gunsmith's repair ledger. He found it under the counter, a thick, greasy book filled with decades of the town's firearm history. He lit a match, its small, flickering flame a bubble of light in the oppressive darkness, and he began to scan the pages. He found the entry on the last page, dated just a week before Caleb's murder. The entry was simple: Sheriff E. Thorne, Winchester 73, repaired faulty firing pin mechanism. The world seemed to tilt on its axis. The match burned down, scorching his fingers, but he barely felt it. He stood in the absolute darkness of the shop. The words from the ledger burned into his mind. Sheriff E. Thorne, repaired faulty firing pin. Elias. His friend. His brother. The man who had sworn on Caleb's memory to find the killers. He was the killer. The betrayal was a physical blow, so profound and so absolute it knocked the air from his lungs. The last 5 years of his life, his grief, his weary quest for justice had all been a lie. A carefully orchestrated piece of theater directed by the one man in the world he had trusted without question. The grief for his brother was suddenly eclipsed by a new, more terrible emotion, the grief for a friendship that had been a monstrous, murderous lie. He stumbled out of the shop and into the back alley, leaning against the cold adobe wall, his mind a maelstrom of rage and pain. He saw it all now, with a horrifying clarity. The partnership, the gold strike, the murder. Elias had killed Caleb to keep the entire claim for himself. The claim jumpers were a fabrication, a ghost story to cover his tracks. The prosperity of the town, the new buildings, the paid-in-for source, it was all built on his brother's blood. He walked through the sleeping town, a man in a waking nightmare. He looked at the sheriff's office, at the light that still burned in the window. He could walk in there right now. He could confront him. He could kill him. The thought was a hot, satisfying fire in his gut, but he stopped. It was too easy. A quick, violent death was a mercy Elias did not deserve. And what would happen then? He would be a wanted man, the killer of a hero sheriff. The town, and its fear and ignorance, would hunt him down. The truth would die with him. No, he needed more. He needed justice. He needed to not just kill Elias. He needed to destroy him. He needed to tear down the entire edifice of lies he had built, to expose him to the town he had fooled, to strip him of his honor, his power, and his name, before finally, taking his life. He returned to his hotel room, the cold knot of purpose in his gut now an icy, solid thing. The grieving brother was gone. The weary traveler was gone. The man who had hoped for a simple, clean justice was gone. In his place was the man he had been trying to outrun for 5 long years. A cold, patient, and ruthlessly efficient hunter. His quest was no longer to find his brother's killer. It was to set a trap for his best friend. The knowledge of Elias's betrayal was a poison that seeped into every corner of John's soul. The warmth of their reunion, the shared memories, the promises of justice, it was all now tainted, a grotesque mockery of the brotherhood he had cherished. He had to force himself to maintain the facade, to continue the charade of their joint investigation, but every friendly word from Elias was like a razor blade against his skin. His grief for Caleb was now intertwined with a cold, focused hatred for the man who had murdered him and then looked him in the eye and sworn to find the killer. John knew he couldn't act on the evidence of the ledger alone. It was his word against that of a beloved, powerful sheriff. He needed more. He needed to understand the how and the why of Elias's transformation from a trusted friend into a monster. He needed to find the other victims, the other ghosts that haunted the hollow of Elias's new kingdom. His search for these ghosts led him to a small, isolated ranch on the edge of the valley, a place the townspeople seemed to avoid. It was the home of a woman named Maria Sanchez. Maria was the widow of the town's previous sheriff, a man named Frank Sanchez. Frank had been a good, honest lawman, a man who had been sheriff when John and Elias were boys. He had died 3 years ago, trampled by his horse in a freak riding accident. Or so the official story went. John, in his new, cynical reality, was beginning to question every official story in Dusty Creek. He found Maria chopping wood behind her small, well-kept adobe house, her movements filled with a weary, resilient strength. She was a woman in her late 40s, her face a beautiful, tragic mask of grief and a deep, simmering anger. When she saw John approaching, her first instinct was to reach for the shotgun leaning against her doorframe. "I mean you no harm, Mrs. Sanchez," John said, stopping a respectful distance away, his hands held open and away from his gun. "You're the sheriff's friend," she replied, her voice cold, her dark eyes filled with suspicion. "That makes you no friend of mine." "Things are not always as they seem," John said, his voice quiet. "I've come to talk about your husband. And about Elias Thorne." The mention of the two names together seemed to break through her hard exterior. She stared at him for a long moment, her eyes searching his. She saw in his haunted, weary face not the friend of the sheriff, but a fellow traveler in the land of grief and betrayal. She lowered the shotgun and gave a curt nod toward her porch. Over a cup of strong, bitter coffee, Maria told him her story. It was a story that mirrored his own in its tragic arc. Her husband, Frank, had been Elias's mentor, the man who had first pinned a deputy's badge on him. They had been close friends. But after the big silver strike, the one that had brought the new prosperity to the town, Frank had begun to change. He had grown worried, suspicious. "He told me Elias was a different man," Maria said, her gaze fixed on the distant, hazy mountains. "The money. It had poisoned him." Frank started to look into the way Elias was acquiring all the new mining claims. Men were disappearing. Others were being forced to sell their land for pennies on the dollar after a string of bad luck fires, rock slides, their wells going dry. Frank knew it wasn't bad luck. It was Elias. He was consolidating his power, building his empire. Her husband had begun his own, secret investigation. He had started to collect evidence, to build a case against the man he had once trusted. He was on the verge of sending for the territorial marshals when he had his accident. "It was no accident," Maria said, her voice a low, venomous whisper. "Frank was the best horseman in this valley. His horse came back to the ranch that night, saddled and calm. But Frank was found at the bottom of a ravine with his neck broken. Elias was the one who found him. He was so comforting, so full of grief. He organized the funeral. He said all the right words. And the whole time, he was a snake, a liar. After the funeral, Elias had come to her house, offering his condolences, and had ransacked her husband's office, claiming he was looking for official town records. She knew he was looking for Frank's evidence. But Frank, a cautious man, had kept his most important findings hidden. Maria led John into her husband's study. From a hidden compartment behind a loose brick in the fireplace, she pulled out a small, leather-bound journal. It was Frank Sanchez's secret ledger. In it, he had meticulously documented every one of Elias's crimes, the forced land sales, the dates of the disappearances, the flow of money, the names of the hired guns he had brought in to act as his enforcers. And on the last page, there was an entry that made John's blood run cold. It was dated the day before Caleb's murder. It read, "Caleb Thatcher came to me today. Worried. Says Elias is trying to cheat him out of his half of the big gold strike in Miller's Canyon. Says Elias threatened him. Advised the boy to be careful. Elias is getting desperate. He is capable of anything." The journal was the final, irrefutable proof. It was the key that unlocked the entire conspiracy. John now had the weapon he needed to not just kill Elias, but to utterly destroy his legacy. He and Maria, two strangers united by a shared story of betrayal at the hands of the same man, had formed a powerful and dangerous alliance. As John prepared to leave, a new, more immediate threat emerged. One of Elias's patrols, two of his hard-faced deputies, rode into the Sanchez yard. They had clearly been sent to check on the reclusive widow, a loose end that Elias was likely growing nervous about. "Mrs. Sanchez," the lead deputy said, his voice a lazy, menacing drawl. "The sheriff was just wondering how you were holding up. And who your guest is." His eyes narrowed as he recognized John. Well, the sheriff's other friend. "What business do you have out here?" The confrontation was sudden, the tension snapping tight. John knew that if they reported he was here talking to Sanchez's widow, Elias's suspicions would be confirmed, and he would act immediately. John and Maria were in mortal danger. His plan for a slow, methodical trap had just been thrown out the window. The timeline had been violently, irrevocably moved up. The air in the small ranch yard grew thick and heavy, the silence broken only by the nervous stamping of the horses. The two deputies sat in their saddles, their hands resting on their thighs, just inches from their pistols. Their expressions were a mixture of suspicion and a lazy, confident menace. They were the law in this valley, and they knew it. John stood on the porch, a few feet from Maria, his own hand hanging loose, his body a steady and deceptive calm. Inside, however, his mind was racing, calculating angles, odds, and consequences. "The sheriff is a busy man," the lead deputy, a man with a cruel, thin-lipped mouth, said to John. "He doesn't like his friends wandering off, especially not to a place that holds sad memories." The veiled threat was unmistakable. "A man has a right to pay his respects," John replied, his voice level, betraying none of the turmoil within him. He was holding Frank Sanchez's journal in his left hand, a damning piece of evidence that he could not allow them to see. "And I have a right to visit my husband's grave," Maria added, her voice sharp and defiant, stepping forward to stand beside John. "Or is that against one of the sheriff's new laws too?" The deputy's thin lips twisted into a sneer. He was not used to being challenged, especially not by a woman. "The sheriff likes to be kept informed," he said, his gaze shifting from Maria back to John. "He's going to be very interested to hear about this little meeting." He began to gather his reins, preparing to turn his horse. John knew he could not let that happen. The moment they rode back to town and reported this meeting to Elias, the game was over. Elias would know that John had uncovered the truth. He would come for them, not with two men, but with his entire gang of enforcers. He would burn this ranch to the ground and bury them all in a shallow grave. The slow, patient trap John had been planning to set was no longer an option. He had to act. Now. As if on cue, the sky, which had been growing dark and bruised all afternoon, opened up. A sudden, violent frontier thunderstorm broke over the valley. The first, fat drops of rain turned into a torrential downpour in a matter of seconds, the sound of it a deafening roar on the adobe dust and the tin roof of the porch. It was a gift from the heavens, a sudden, chaotic cloak of confusion. In the instant that the deputies were distracted by the sudden downpour, their gazes momentarily turning to the sky, John moved. He was not the weary traveler anymore. He was the gunfighter. He shoved Maria behind him, into the relative safety of the doorway, and drew his pistol. The world seemed to slow down, the falling raindrops hanging in the air like suspended crystals. His movements were a blur of pure, economical violence. He fired twice. The 2 gunshots were almost indistinguishable from a sharp, sudden clap of thunder. The lead deputy was not clean from his saddle, a look of shocked surprise on his face, a dark hole appearing on his chest. The second deputy, reacting a fraction of a second slower, managed to draw his own gun, but John's second shot took him in the shoulder, spinning him around and sending him toppling into the mud. It was over in 2 heartbeats. The rain lashed down, washing the blood from the dead man into the thirsty earth, and turning the ranch yard into a churning sea of mud. The second deputy lay groaning on the ground, clutching his shattered shoulder. John stood on the porch, the smoke from his colt mixing with the steam rising from the hot ground. He felt the old, familiar coldness settle over him. He had just killed a man wearing a star, and wounded another. He was no longer an investigator. He was an outlaw. He walked over to the wounded deputy, his gun still leveled. The man looked up at him, his face a mask of pain and terror. "Please," he whimpered. John knelt in the mud beside him. "You have a choice," he said, his voice a low, cold whisper that cut through the sound of the rain. "You can lie here and bleed to death. Or you can take a message back to your boss." "A message," the deputy stammered. "You tell Elias Thorne that John knows everything," he said, his voice as hard as a coffin nail. "You tell him I have Frank Sanchez's journal. You tell him I know what he did to my brother. And you tell him I am coming for him. The game is over. This ends now." He tore a strip from the deputy's shirt and fashioned a crude tourniquet for the man's shoulder. "Now get on your horse," John ordered, "and ride." The terrified, wounded man scrambled to his feet, hauled himself into his saddle, and galloped away, a messenger of doom riding through the storm. John stood in the rain, watching him go. The die was cast. He had just issued a direct, undeniable declaration of war. He had abandoned his plan for a slow, methodical trap and had instead opted for a direct, brutal confrontation. He had given up the element of surprise, but he had gained something else, the initiative. He was no longer waiting for Elias to make a move. He was forcing him to react, to come out of his fortress, to meet him on a battlefield of John's choosing. He turned to Maria, who was staring at him, her face pale, her eyes wide with a mixture of fear and a new, fierce admiration. "He will come for us now," she said, "with everyone he has." "I know," John replied, his gaze turning toward the distant, hazy shape of Miller's Canyon, the place where his brother had died. "And we will be waiting for him." The reckoning, which he had so patiently planned for, had arrived ahead of schedule, borne on the wings of a summer storm. The storm that had broken over the valley was a reflection of the one raging inside John's soul. The act of killing again, of willingly embracing the violence he had spent 5 years trying to escape, had unearthed the ghosts he had tried to keep buried. As he and Maria prepared the small ranch for the inevitable siege, barricading the windows and stockpiling ammunition, his mind was not on the coming battle, but on the past one that had defined him. The memory of the confrontation at the Hollister homestead, the event that had turned him into a fugitive from his own life, returned with a vivid, painful clarity. Flashback. The sun was high and hot in the Wyoming sky. A younger John, 24 years old, and already a veteran of a dozen gunfights, sat on his horse on a low rise, looking down at the small, defiant homestead. He was not a killer by nature, but he had discovered he had a talent for violence, a kind of cold, detached focus that made him preternaturally fast and accurate with a pistol. It was a talent that paid well, and he needed the money. He had just received a letter from Lily, telling him of her acceptance into the prestigious convent school in Santa Fe. It was her dream, a chance to escape the harsh, brutal world they had been born into. The price of that dream was $500. The job he was on now, working for a ruthless cattle baron named Magnuson, paid $1,000. This was his last job. One last walk through the Valley of the Shadow, and then he and Lily would be free. His job was to intimidate, to put the fear of God into a stubborn homesteader named Hollister who was refusing to sell his land that Magnuson wanted for its access to a river. John was to be the negotiator, the final, menacing argument. He rode down to the homestead alone, leaving Magnuson and his half-dozen brutish thugs on the ridge. He was met on the porch by Hollister, a man as stubborn and weathered as the land he worked, his two teenage sons standing behind him, their hands holding old, long-barreled hunting rifles. "I ain't sellin'," Malone, Hollister said, his voice a low growl. "This is my land. I bled for it." "Magnuson is not a patient man, mister," Hollister, John said, his voice quiet, reasonable. "He's offering you a fair price. A better price than you'll get after your house burns down and your cattle are run off." He was delivering the threat, but he hated the taste of the words in his mouth. He saw Hollister's wife and young daughter peeking from behind the curtains of the window, their faces pale with fear. The negotiation was a stalemate. Hollister was a man of principle, and he would not be moved. As John was preparing to ride back to Magnuson and report his failure, the situation exploded. Magnuson, impatient and bloodthirsty, decided the time for talk was over. He and his men spurred their horses and charged down the hill, their rifles blazing. It was a stupid, pointless act of violence. John, caught in the middle, reacted on instinct. He drew his own pistol, not to join the attack, but to try and control the chaos, firing into the air, yelling at Magnuson to hold his fire. But it was too late. The Hollister boys, defending their home, returned fire. The air was filled with the roar of guns and the whine of ricocheting bullets. It was over in seconds. One of Hollister's sons went down, clutching his chest. Magnuson, enraged, rode right up to the porch and shot the old man in cold blood. And then came the sound that would haunt John forever. A single, piercing scream from inside the house. A stray bullet from which gun, he would never know, and that was the agony of it that had gone through the thin plank wall of the house. A moment later, Mrs. Hollister emerged, her face a mask of numb, uncomprehending horror. In her arms, she carried the limp body of her 10-year-old daughter, a small, dark hole in the front of her simple calico dress. The little girl's eyes were open, staring blankly at the sky. The world went silent. The gunfire stopped. Magnuson and his men stared, their brutal triumph turning to a sudden, shocked unease. For John, it was as if a switch had been flipped in his soul. He looked at the dead child, an innocent caught in a crossfire of greed and ego, and he saw Lily. He saw the future he was supposedly fighting for, stained with the blood of someone else's sister, someone else's daughter. The man who had prided himself on his cold, professional detachment, the man who killed for money but never for pleasure, was consumed by a white-hot, cleansing rage. He turned his gun on Magnuson. The cattle baron's eyes widened in disbelief. "Malone, what the hell are you?" He never finished the sentence. John shot him squarely between the eyes. He then turned on the rest of Magnuson's men. It was not a gunfight. It was an execution. He moved through them like the Reaper they had called him, his face a cold, emotionless mask, his gun spitting fire with a chilling, mechanical precision. When it was over, 6 more bodies lay in the dust of the Hollister yard. John stood in the carnage, the smoke curling from his pistols. He looked at the grieving mother, at the remaining son trying to comfort her, at the dead patriarch on the porch. He had not saved them. He had only avenged them. And in doing so, he had become a monster, a creature of pure, indiscriminate violence. The price of Lily's future had been this family's destruction. He had gotten on his horse, without a word, without collecting his blood money, and had ridden away. He had ridden away from his name, from his life, from the ghost of that little girl in the calico dress. He had disappeared into the wilderness, vowing never to use his guns again, a man in a self-imposed exile, chained to the memory of the innocent life his own violent world had extinguished. And flashback. The rain stopped. The gray light of dawn began to filter into the small, barricaded ranch house. John stood at the window, his father's old Winchester in his hands, its stock worn smooth by use. The memory had not brought him the old, familiar agony. Instead, it had brought him a strange, cold clarity. He was not that man anymore. The violence he had just committed, the killing of the deputy, had not been an act of rage or for profit. It had been an act of protection. He had not started this fight. He was finishing it. He looked over at Maria, who was cleaning and loading a shotgun with a calm, steady efficiency. She was a survivor, just like him. They were two ghosts, haunted by the same man, now preparing to make their last stand. He was still a killer. The West had made sure of that. But he finally understood the difference between killing for a living and fighting for a life. And for that cause, he was willing to become the ghost one last time. He was no longer just fighting for Caleb's memory. He was fighting for the memory of the little girl in Wyoming, and for the future of the woman who now stood beside him. His burden had not been lifted, but it had been transformed. It was no longer a chain, it was a shield. The day dawned gray and menacing, the sky the color of dirty steel, the air heavy with the promise of more rain. The Sanchez Ranch was an island of desperate defiance in a sea of encroaching hostility. John and Maria had worked through the night, their movements economical and purposeful, transforming the small, peaceful homestead into a formidable death trap. They were seasoned, pragmatic survivors, and their preparations were a masterclass in guerrilla defense. They didn't just barricade the windows of the main house, they knocked holes in the thick adobe walls, creating unexpected firing ports. They overturned a heavy wagon in the main yard, creating a solid piece of cover. They used the ranch's meager supply of barbed wire not to fence in cattle, but to create a series of hidden, entangling obstacles in the tall grass surrounding the property. They did not have to wait long. Just after sunrise, they appeared on the horizon. A long, dark line of riders, at least 15 of them, moving not with the chaotic energy of a posse, but with the disciplined, confident pace of a small army. At their head rode Elias Thorne, his familiar figure now a chilling, alien sight. He was no longer John's friend, the respectable sheriff. He was a warlord, come to crush the last pocket of resistance to his rule. They did not charge. Elias was too smart for that. He was a chess player, and he intended to conduct this siege with a cold, methodical precision. He had his men dismount a few hundred yards out, using a low rise for cover, and then they began to advance, spreading out, a tightening noose around the small ranch. The first shots of the battle were not a thunderous volley, but the sharp, clear crack of a single rifle. John, positioned in a small loft in the barn, had a perfect vantage point. He was using his father's old Winchester, a gun he knew as well as he knew his own hands. He was not a man who wasted ammunition. His first shot took the horse out from under one of Elias's lieutenants, sending the man sprawling. His second shot, a moment later, kicked up dust just inches from the man's head as he scrambled for cover, a clear, contemptuous warning. The battle for the Sanchez Ranch began. It was a long, brutal, and intimate affair. It was not a battle of armies, but of individuals. John moved between the house and the barn, a phantom of vengeance, his rifle speaking in a steady, deadly rhythm. He never stayed in one place for long, creating the illusion that there were more defenders than there actually were. He was not just a gunfighter, he was a tactician, using the terrain, the light, and the very structure of the buildings he was defending to his advantage. Maria fought alongside him, a lioness defending her den. She was not a trained gunfighter, but she was a woman with a deep, righteous anger and a steady hand. She used her shotgun with devastating effect, its wide blast of buckshot a perfect weapon for defending the close quarters of the house. She and John fought with a silent and spoken synergy, two wounded souls who had found a common purpose in this desperate, final stand. Elias, directing the attack from the rise, grew increasingly frustrated. His superior numbers were being neutralized by the clever defenses and the ferocious, unexpectedly effective resistance of the two defenders. He was losing men. The siege, which he had expected to be a quick, brutal affair, was turning into a bloody, grinding stalemate. His men, accustomed to being the predators, were not enjoying their new role as the prey. Their morale began to fray. As the day wore on, a new, desperate element was added to the fight. Elias, in a fit of rage, ordered his men to use fire. They fashioned crude torches and began to advance on the barn, intending to burn John out of his fortified position. The barn, full of dry hay, was a tinderbox. John knew he couldn't hold it. As the first torches were thrown, and the flames began to lick at the old, dry wood, he made a fighting retreat back to the main house, the smoke and heat at his back. Now they were trapped. The two of them, in the small adobe house, with the barn burning furiously, casting a hellish, orange glow over the battlefield, and a dozen angry, bloodthirsty men closing in. The end seemed inevitable. But John had one last, desperate card to play. He knew that Elias, in his arrogance, would want to be the one to deliver the final blow. He would want to look his old friend in the eye as he destroyed him. John was counting on that arrogance. He had Maria lay down a covering fire from a side window, and then, under the cover of the smoke from the burning barn, he did the last thing Elias would expect. He charged. He burst from the front door of the house, not running away, but running directly toward Elias's position on the rise. He was a single, solitary figure, a man charging an army, an act of such insane, suicidal courage that it momentarily stunned Elias's men into inaction. He did not get far. A half-dozen rifles opened up, bullets kicking up dirt around him, one of them tearing through the fleshy part of his arm. He dove behind the overturned wagon in the center of the yard, pinned down, a wounded, solitary target. It was exactly where he wanted to be. He was in the open, a clear target. He had made himself the bait, and he knew that Elias, the master chess player, would not be able to resist the temptation to personally take the king. The final, personal confrontation between the two friends who had become mortal enemies was about to begin. The battlefield fell into a tense, expectant silence, broken only by the hungry roar of the burning barn. John lay behind the overturned wagon, the pain in his arm a dull, steady throb. His world narrowed to this small patch of blood-soaked ground. He was pinned down, a single, wounded man. From his position on the rise, Elias Thorne watched, a slow, triumphant smile spreading across his face. He had won. The trap was sprung. The final piece was cornered. "Give it up, John," Elias's voice boomed across the yard, full of a false, magnanimous authority. "It's over. You can't win. Throw out your gun, and I'll give you a clean death. A better death than your brother got." The mention of Caleb was a deliberate, cruel twist of the knife. John didn't answer. He was listening, waiting. Elias, his ego demanding a final, theatrical victory, made the mistake John had been counting on. He decided to walk down from his safe position and face his old friend himself. He gestured for his men to hold their fire. This was his moment. He strode down the gentle slope, his Winchester held at the ready, his movements filled with the arrogant confidence of a man who held all the cards. "You should have just kept riding, John," Elias said, his voice now closer, conversational, as he slowly advanced on the wagon. "You should have let the past lie. This town was better off. I made it better." "You made it a graveyard," John's voice replied from behind the wagon. "You built it on the bones of my brother and Frank Sanchez." "They were weak," Elias snarled, his mask of civility finally slipping to reveal the raw, rapacious greed beneath. "They were sentimental fools. They found the greatest gold strike in this territory, and they wanted to share it, to register it, to let the whole world in on it. They lacked vision. I have vision." He was now only 30 yards from the wagon. He raised his rifle, preparing for the final, satisfying shot that would erase the last ghost of his past. And then, the world erupted. From the rocks and gullies on the far side of the valley, from behind Elias's own position, a sudden, shocking volley of rifle fire roared to life. It was not a large force, but it was a well-aimed and completely unexpected one. Elias's men on the rise, their attention focused entirely on the drama unfolding in the yard below, were caught completely by surprise. 2 of them fell, dead or wounded, before they could even react. The others, their discipline shattered, scrambled for cover, firing wildly at this new and seen enemy. Elias spun around, his face a mask of shocked disbelief. He had been flanked. He had been outmaneuvered. At the same instant, John made his move. He rose from behind the wagon, his own rifle coming to his shoulder. At the same time, Maria opened up from the house, her shotgun booming, providing a covering fire that forced the men closest to the house to dive for cover. Elias was trapped. He was caught in a perfect crossfire, between John in the yard, Maria in the house, and the new mysterious force in the hills behind him. His small army, which had been on the verge of victory, had collapsed into a panicked, disorganized mob, being picked off from 2 sides. The new rivals were not an army. It was the town. It was the ghost of Frank Sanchez's law. Sheriff Thorne from the previous story's town, a man John had sent a desperate rider for days ago, had arrived with a posse of his own hardened deputies and a handful of the Dust Devil Gulch militia members who had fought alongside Clara. They were the cavalry, arriving not with a bugle charge, but with the steady, deadly rhythm of well-aimed rifle fire. Elias, his carefully laid siege shattered, his army disintegrating around him, had only one thought: escape. He turned and ran, not back toward his men, but toward the relative cover of the burning barn, toward the horses that were tethered there. John did not shoot him in the back. That was not the justice he had come for. He pursued him, his long legs eating up the ground, his own pain forgotten in the final, desperate rush of the hunt. The two men, the two friends who had become mortal enemies, met in the hellish, swirling smoke and embers of the burning barn. Elias, his face wild with terror, managed to get to his horse. He swung himself into the saddle. John arrived a second later, grabbing the horse's reins, his face a grim mask of finality. Elias, from his position on the horse, turned and fired his rifle from the hip. The shot was hurried and aimed. The bullet struck John high in the chest, the impact throwing him backward into the mud and chaos. Elias, seeing his enemy fall, let out a raw, triumphant roar. He spurred his horse, ready to gallop away, to disappear and start again, as he always had. But as he turned, a final, single gunshot cracked from the doorway of the house. It was not the heavy boom of a rifle or a shotgun. It was the sharp, distinct report of a Colt peacemaker. Maria stood on the porch, John's own pistol held in both of her steady hands. Her shot was perfect. It took Elias in the back, just below the neck. He stiffened in the saddle, a look of profound, ultimate surprise on his face, before he slowly, deliberately, toppled sideways and fell to the ground. His life's ambition ending in the mud and ash of a failed siege. The death of Elias Thorne was the stone that, when pulled, caused the entire corrupt edifice of Dusty Creek to collapse. His leaderless enforcers, caught between the town's militia and the fire from the ranch house, quickly threw down their guns and surrendered. The siege was over. The short, brutal reign of the false sheriff had come to an end. Maria, her face a pale, tear-streaked mask, rushed from the house to where John had fallen. The bullet had taken him high in the shoulder, a terrible, bloody wound, but it had missed his heart. He was alive. As the sun began to set, casting long, peaceful shadows over the smoking, corpse-strewn battlefield, the combined forces of the two towns carried their wounded hero back to the Sanchez ranch house. The days that followed were a blur of pain and healing, both for John and for the town of Dusty Creek. Maria, with a quiet, fierce tenderness, nursed him back from the brink of death, her skills as a frontier woman extending to the dressing of wounds and the brewing of healing teas. As John slowly regained his strength, the town, under the temporary, steady hand of the visiting sheriff, began the process of lancing the poison of Elias's rule. Frank Sanchez's journal, combined with the testimony of a dozen terrorized citizens, was all the proof the territorial marshal needed. The full extent of Elias's crime-esque murder of Caleb, the accident that had killed Frank Sanchez, the campaign of terror and extortion was laid bare. The town's prosperity, it turned out, was a lie, its foundations mortgaged to a shadowy syndicate of investors Elias had been in league with. The town was not just morally bankrupt, it was financially bankrupt as well. But it was not without hope. The people of Dusty Creek, who had been cowed into submission, had found their courage in the crucible of the siege. They had seen that the law was not just a star worn by a powerful man, but a principle that lived in the hearts of ordinary people willing to fight for it. They formed a new town council, a true one this time, and began the hard, honest work of rebuilding their community not on a foundation of stolen gold, but on one of shared purpose. John, as he recovered, was a reluctant hero. The townspeople looked at him with a kind of awe, the man who had single-handedly faced down a tyrant. They offered him the position of sheriff. They offered him a share in the now communal mining claims. They offered him a home. He sat on the porch of Maria's ranch, his arm in a sling, looking out at the valley that had cost him so much. He had come here for a simple, clean vengeance. He had found a messy, complicated, and deeply human struggle for justice. He had found his brother's killer, and in doing so, had been forced to confront the ghosts of his own violent past. He had paid his debt to his brother, but the cost had been higher than he had ever imagined. He knew he could not stay. He was a gunfighter, a man of violence. His purpose here was served. This new, hopeful town needed builders, not destroyers. Its future belonged to people like Maria, and the good, decent folks who were determined to make a new start. He was a relic of the past, a ghost who had lingered too long in the world of the living. The silence that followed the final gunshot was more profound than the roar of the battle that had preceded it. It was a silence filled with endings and beginnings, a vacuum into which the future of Dusty Creek would be written. The smoke from the dying embers of the barn drifted lazily into the gray post-storm sky, a final, hazy ghost of the violence that had transpired. The surviving members of Elias Thorne's gang, their faces a mixture of shock and a strange, almost palpable relief, were rounded up by the combined forces of the two towns. There was no more fight in them. Their leader was dead, their reign of terror broken, their purpose extinguished. They were just men again, pathetic and defeated, stripped of the power that had made them monsters. Inside the small, bullet-scarred adobe house, the world had shrunk to the size of a single room. John lay on Maria's bed, drifting in and out of a feverish, pain-filled haze, while she worked with a fierce, quiet determination to save his life. The bullet had torn through his shoulder, shattering the bone and leaving a ragged, angry wound. It was a wound that could easily have turned septic, a death sentence in this remote corner of the world. But Maria fought for him with the same stubborn, resilient spirit with which she had fought for her home. She cleaned the wound with whiskey, the only antiseptic she had, her touch surprisingly gentle for hands so accustomed to hard labor. She probed for and removed the bone fragments with a pair of blacksmith's tongs, sterilized in the fire. She stitched the wound closed with a horsehair needle and thread, her movements precise and sure. She was not just a widow and a rancher, she was a healer, a protector, a woman who had seen too much death and was now defiantly willing life back into this broken man. For 3 days, John's life hung in the balance. He was haunted by fever dreams, vivid, fragmented nightmares that dragged him back through the landscapes of his violent past. He was back in the bloody yard of the Hollister homestead, the face of the dead little girl staring at him with his own brother's eyes. He was in Miller's Canyon, watching Elias stand over Caleb's body, his friend's face twisting into a demonic snare. He was in the burning barn, the heat of the flames indistinguishable from the fever that was consuming him. He cried out in his sleep, the names of the dead a tortured litany on his lips. And through it all, Maria was there, a constant, soothing presence. She bathed his head with cool water, she forced bitter, healing teas between his clenched teeth, and she spoke to him in a low, quiet voice, her words a lifeline in his sea of delirium. While John fought his inner demons, the town of Dusty Creek was fighting its own. The visiting sheriff from the neighboring town, a man of quiet, simple integrity, helped the shell-shocked citizens pick up the pieces. Elias Thorne's reign had not just been a physical one, it had been a moral one. He had corrupted the town, teaching its people to survive through fear, silence, and complicity. Now, they had to learn how to be a community again. The first step was the truth. Frank Sanchez's journal, presented at a town meeting by a newly confident and articulate Maria, was a revelation. It laid bare the entire sordid history of Elias's rise to power. The townspeople listened in a stunned, shamed silence. They had been fooled, manipulated, and turned into willing prisoners in their own homes. The anger they felt was directed not just at the dead, false sheriff, but at themselves, for their own weakness, for their own willingness to trade their freedom for a liar's promise of prosperity. This collective guilt became the foundation for a new beginning. They formed a new town council, a true one, with Maria Sanchez reluctantly but unanimously elected as its head. They reopened the sheriff's office, not as a seat of power, but as a place of service. The dead were buried, the wounded were tended to, and the slow, hard work of rebuilding began. On the 4th day, John's fever broke. He awoke to the sight of Maria sitting in a chair by his bed, her face exhausted but her eyes clear. The room was quiet, the only sound the gentle chirping of birds outside the window. The war was over. "You saved my life," he said, his voice a dry and used rasp. "You saved all of ours," she replied, a small, sad smile touching her lips. "I guess we're even." In the weeks of his slow, painful recovery, a quiet and spoken bond grew between them. They were two solitary souls, both widowed by the same man's betrayal, both haunted by their own ghosts. They did not speak of love or the future, their wounds were too raw for such things. Instead, they spoke of the past, sharing their stories, their griefs, their regrets. John spoke of Caleb, of the burden of his reputation, and, for the first time in his life, he spoke aloud of the little girl in Wyoming, the memory that had been the true source of his self-imposed exile. Maria, in turn, spoke of Frank, of their shared dreams, and of the long, lonely years of her silent, angry grief. In sharing their burdens, they found that the weight of them lessened, just a little. John became a reluctant hero. The townspeople, when he was finally strong enough to walk the main street again, his arm in a sling, would nod to him with a quiet, profound respect. He was the man who had brought the reckoning, the man who had lanced the boil of their corruption. They offered him everything. The position of sheriff, a share in the mining claims that the council was now managing on behalf of the town, a plot of land to build a house. They wanted him to stay, to be their protector, their symbol of this new, hard-won integrity. He sat on the porch of Maria's ranch, looking out at the valley. It was a good place. A decent place, now. A place a man could build a life. He looked at Maria, at her strong, beautiful, resilient face, and he saw the possibility of a future he had long since given up on. He could stay. He could hang up his gun. He could be a rancher, a husband, a part of a community. But as he looked down at his own hands, he knew it was a lie. He saw the calluses from years of holding a gun, the scars from a dozen different fights. He could learn to be a rancher, but he would always be a gunfighter. The instincts, the coldness, the ability to kill without hesitation, it was not a coat he could take off. It was a part of his very bones. And he knew that a town like the New Dusty Creek, a town trying to build a future on peace and law, had no place for a man like him. His presence would always be a reminder of the violence it had taken to win that peace. He was a relic, a ghost from the very world they were trying to escape. On the day he was finally strong enough to sit a horse for a long ride, he knew it was time. He saddled his horse, his movements slow but steady. Maria came out onto the porch. She did not try to stop him. She saw the truth in his eyes, the same truth he saw in his own hands. "You don't have to go," she said, her voice catching slightly. "There's a place for you here, with me." It was the closest either of them had come to speaking the fragile and spoken thing that had grown between them. "The man you're offering a place to, Maria," he replied, his voice a low, gentle rasp, full of a deep and painful honesty, "died a long time ago in a canyon with his brother. And the man I am now, he doesn't belong in a town like the one you're going to build. You are the future of this place. I'm just the past." He reached out and touched her cheek, a brief, tender gesture that was more intimate than any kiss. "Build something good here. Something worthy of the price that was paid for it." He mounted his horse. He had no destination in mind. He was not running from anything anymore. He was not chasing anything. He was simply moving on. His quest was over. His brother was avenged. A kind of terrible, brutal justice had been done. He was free of his past, but in that freedom, he found that he was also untethered, a man without a purpose, without a place. His last stop was the small, simple graveyard at the edge of town. He stood for a long time before the three graves that now stood side by side. On one side was Caleb, his innocence finally at peace. On the other was Frank Sanchez, his honor restored. And in the middle was the new and marked grave of Elias Thorne. John looked at the grave of his friend who had become his enemy, and he felt no hatred. He felt no triumph. He felt only a vast, profound, and soul-deep pity. Pity for a man who had gained a whole valley, and in doing so, had lost his own soul. He turned his horse and rode west. He did not look back. He rode toward the setting sun, a solitary, wounded figure against a vast, indifferent, and beautiful sky. He had ridden into Dusty Creek seeking justice for his brother, and had found it, twisted and broken, in the heart of his best friend. He left the town to its hard-won future, a future he had secured but could never be a part of. He rode off to find a place where a man like him, a man who was no longer a gunfighter but could never be anything else, could finally, and truly, be at peace with his own ghosts.